Assalamu alaikum. Mohtaram Nazreen, उम्मीद छ तु ٲسِو خٲر سان سانہِ طرفہٕ وٲتِن تۄہہِ پُرخلوٗص سلام تہٕ دُعا یِتھ کٔنۍ زَن تۄہہِ پاے چھِ کہِ پٔتمہِ کینٛہو ہفتو پٮ۪ٹھ یُس اَسہِ فوکس چھُ روٗدمُت پینڈ آن لاینَس پٮ۪ٹھ سُہ چھُ روٗدمُت اَسہِ یُس اَسہِ کٔشیٖر منٛز وٕنکیٚنَس واریاہ بوٚڑ وباہ چھُ ڈرٛگ یا مُنشِیاتَن ہُنٛد تَتھ رِلیٹِڈ تہٕ أسۍ چھِ فِلحال اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ فوکس کران پننہِ طرفہٕ چھِ أسۍ کوٗشِش کران کہِ أسۍ کیاہ ہٮ۪کو اَتھ متعلق کٔرِتھ کیونکہِ یُس اَمِچ وٕنکیٚنَس لیول چھِ کٔشیٖر منٛز یا یوٗتاہ اَمہِ وبہُک اثر چھُ سُہ چھُ دۄہ کھۄتہٕ دۄہ بڑان تہٕ ہر گرٕ چھُ کُنہِ نتہٕ کُنہِ طریٖقہٕ اَتھ منٛز مُلوِث گژھان یا ہر گرٕ چھُ کُنہِ نتہٕ کُنہِ طریٖقہٕ اَمہِ سۭتۍ مُتٲثر گژھان اَمہِ برونٛہہ کہِ یہِ وَلہِ اَسہِ پوٗرٕ پٲٹھۍ نال أسۍ چھِ یژھان کہِ پننہِ طرفہٕ کرو أسۍ کوٗشِش ایز معاشرٕ ایز قوم کہِ کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ ہٮ۪کو أسۍ اَمیُک ازالہٕ کٔرِتھ یا کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کو أسۍ رُکاوٹ کٔرِتھ اَمِچ ییٚمہِ سپیٖڈ سان یہِ بڑان چھِ اَسہِ چھِ پینڈ آن لاینَس پٮ۪ٹھ اَتھ متعلق اکھ اٮ۪پروچ تھومُت کہِ أسۍ کرو اکھ ایجوکیٹِو تہٕ کیوٗریٹِو اٮ۪پروچ ڈیولپ دیٹ میٖنٕز کہِ اَسہِ چھُ اکھ ٹوٗ پرٛانٛگ یا دُترفی سٹریٹجی یا دُترفی اپروچ تھومُت نمبر ون ایجوکیٹِو کہِ أسۍ سمجھو أسۍ زانو کہِ کیاہ چھُ یہِ منشِیاتن ہُنٛد یُس اَسہِ یہِ وبا یا یُس اَسہِ یہِ مُصیبت چھُ وٕنکیٚنس کٔشیٖر پٮ۪ٹھ آمُت یہِ کیاہ چھُ کیاہ دٔلیٖل چھِ یِمہٕ ایکسپٲٹ چھِ یِم ڈاکٹر چھِ یِم سایکو تھراپسٹ چھِ تِم کِتھ کٔنۍ چھِ اَتھ چیٖزس سمجھان یہِ کِتھ کٔنۍ چھُ سٲنِس سماجس منٛز ژامُت یہِ کِتھ کٔنۍ چھُ سانٮ۪ن بچن تامَتھ واتان کیاہ چھِ اَمِکۍ مُضِر اثرات یہِ کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ چھِ اِمپیکٹ کران سٲنِس معاشرس دوٚیِم چھِ پتہٕ کیوٗریٹِو چلو اَسہِ لٔج پاے کہِ یہِ چھُ واریاہ بوٚڑ مُصیبت اَمِکۍ چھِ واریاہ اثرات سٲنِس معاشرس پٮ۪ٹھ سٲنِس قومس پٮ۪ٹھ سٲنِس مُستقبِلس پٮ۪ٹھ یہِ چھُ طریٖقہٕ طریٖقہٕ اَسہِ مُتٲثر کران تہٕ أسۍ کِتھ کٔنۍ کرو اَمیُک عزال أسۍ کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کون یہِ ختم کٔرِتھ یا ییٚمہِ سپیٖڈٕ سان یہِ پکان چھُ تتھ کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کو أسۍ رُکاوٹ أنِتھ سُہ چھُ کیوٗریٹِو اپروچ تہٕ ییٚلہِ أسۍ کیوٗریٹِو اپروچٕچ کتھ چھِ کران کیونکہِ یہِ چھُ تیوٗتاہ بوٚڑ مُصیبت اَتھ چھُنہٕ اکُے پہلوٗ کینٛہہ کہِ اگر أسۍ وَنو کہِ اَتھ چھا بس طبی یا میڈِکل پہلوٗ نہ اَتھ منٛز چھِ معاشری معاشرتی پہلوٗ تہِ اَتھ منٛز چھُ رُحٲنی پہلوٗ تہِ أتھی پس منظرس منٛز اوس اَسہِ پٔتمہِ ہفتہٕ پٔتمہِ بٹوارِ کوٚرمُت کہِ یِم اَسہِ ڈاکٹر صاحبان چھِ یوٗ کے یس منٛز پنٕنۍ کٲشِر یِم ایکسپٲٹ چھِ أتھۍ سۭتۍ ڈیٖل کران ڈرگ اڈِکشن یا کٔشیٖر منٛز یِم اَسہِ ڈاکٹر چھِ اَتھ سۭتۍ ڈیٖل کران تِم کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ چھِ سمجھان یہِ ڈرگ اڈِکشنُک یُس آسپیکٹ چھُ یا یہِ ڈرگ اڈِکشنُک یُس اَسہِ مُصیبت چھُ آمُت تِم کِتھ کٔنۍ چھِ سمجھان تتھ کہِ اکھ طبی پہلوٗ نِمو أسۍ بیاکھ یُس أسۍ وَنان چھِ کہِ اَتھ چھُ بیاکھ اکھ واریاہ اہم پہلوٗ یُس رُحٲنی پہلوٗ چھُ یا معاشری یا سمٲجی پہلوٗ چھُ اگر أسۍ تَمِچ کتھ کرو کہِ تٔتھۍ مُتعلق چھِ اَسہِ أزیُک یُس پروگرام چھُ سُہ کرِ فوکس تٔتھۍ چیٖزس پٮ۪ٹھ تہٕ اَتھ رِلیٹِڈ چھِ اَسہِ زٕ ایکسپٲٹ پانس سۭتۍ أنمٕتۍ یا زٕ مہمان یِم اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ کتھ کران یِم چھِنہٕ کٲشِر کینٛہہ مگر ییٚمہِ حِسابہٕ یِہنٛزِ زندگی ہُنٛد کٲفی عرصہٕ چھِ أتھۍ مُصیبت یا أتھۍ پریشٲنی سۭتۍ اَمیُک اَتھ فایٹ کرنس سۭتۍ اَمیُک مُقابلہٕ کرنس سۭتۍ یا اَتھ سمجھنس یا لُکن اَمِچ اویرنیس دِنس سۭتۍ روٗدمُت یا تِم کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کن اَتھ فایٹ کٔرِتھ تَمی موٗجوٗب باسیٚو اَسہِ واریاہ زیادٕ ضروٗری کہِ أسۍ کروکھ یِم اپروچ تہٕ یِم اَسہِ سۭتۍ حظ جُڑیمٕتۍ چھِ تِمن منٛز چھُ ڈاکٹر برایس بامر ڈاکٹر برایس بامر یِم چھِ اکھ میننایٹ مِنِسٹر تہٕ یِمن چھُ لگ بگ 20-25 ؤرین ہُنٛد ایکٕسپیٖرینس یُس یہِ ڈرگ اڈِکشن چھِ اَکہِ روٗحٲنی پہلوٗ سۭتۍ اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ وٕچھنُک اَمہِ مٔزیٖد یِہنٛزٕ ڈیٖٹیلٕز ہیٚکِو تُہۍ یُس اَسہِ پوسٹر تہِ چھُ اپلوڈ کوٚرمُت تَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ تہِ وٕچھِتھ یِم چھِ اکیڈمِک تہِ روٗدمٕتۍ وٕنکیٚنس چھِ یِم رِٹایر گٔمٕتۍ اَمہِ برونٛہہ ٲسۍ یِم اسسٹنٹ پروفیسر مارٹن لوٗتھر یونیورسٹی کالیجس منٛز تہٕ یا مُسلِم سوشل سٔروِسز یُس کینیڈا یا اونٹیریوس منٛز چھِ یِم چھِ تَمہِ کِس بورڈس منٛز چھِ انٹرفیت ڈایلاگ تِمن پٮ۪ٹھ تہِ چھِ یِمو واریاہ کٲم کٔرمٕژ یِتھٕے کٔنٮ۪تھ چھِ اَسہِ سۭتۍ آز جُڑیمٕتۍ گریگ یا أسۍ وَنو تِمن ولید کھاولیک تہٕ ولید تہِ چھُ اَسہِ سۭتۍ واریاہ زیادٕ اہم یِہُنٛد جُڑُن آز کیونکہِ نمبر ون یِم تہِ چھِ یِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ برایس بامر زیادٕ اہم چھِ کہِ یِم چھِ ایلکوہولِکس انانمس اکھ اِدارٕ یُس 1915 منٛز آیہِ ایسٹیبلِش کرنہٕ کہِ یُس یہِ ایڈِکشن یا سبسٹنس ابیوز بڑان ٲسۍ یا ایلکوہول کنزمپشن بڑان ٲس یوٗ ایس یا امیرکازن منٛز تتھ رِلیٹِڈ آو یہِ 12 سٹیپ پروگرام کہِ اکھ فرد کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ ہیٚکہِ پانے اَتھ چیٖزُک اَمہِ چیٖزُک عزال کٔرِتھ کیاہ پروگرامز آسان تہٕ یُس ولید چھُ یِہُنٛد چھُ اکھ اِدارٕ یتھ أسۍ وَنان چھِ مِلت-اِ-اِسلامی سُہ تہِ چھُ بالکُل ایلکوہولِکس انانمسُک مگر تِمن لُکن خٲطرٕ یِمن ایٖمان چھِ یا یِم مُسلمان چھِ یِم خۄدایس زانن وٲلۍ چھِ خۄدایس مانن وٲلۍ چھِ تِم کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کن پننہِ ایٖمان تھروٗ اَمہِ چیٖزُک یہِ عزالہٕ کٔرِتھ یا تتھ فایٹ کٔرِتھ طبی پہلوٗوس سۭتۍ سۭتۍ تو تتھ رِلیٹِڈ چھِ اَسہِ حظ گریگ یِم اَسہِ تتھ پٮ۪ٹھ تہِ دِنۍ اِنفارمیشن دوٚیِم چیٖز یِم أسۍ پانہٕ अथ अमिक शिकार गमत अगर अस वनो ड्रग अब्यूज यमो किथ कनेथ छुड़ो पनुन पान तम निश यमो किथ कनेथ यहुस किथ कन रूज सह जर्नी तथ पेठन करो अस कथ बे यम मिल्लत इस्लामिया सत सत यमो प्लेटफॉर्म बनोमुत यथ islamawaken.com वनान यथ पेठन अस कुरान तमिश ट्रांसलेशन तमिश तफसीर मुख्तलिफ मुनफरिद लैंग्वेजन मजन कुरानुक ट्रांसलेशन या तर्जुम तथ रिलेटेड तमिच इन्फॉर्मेशन तस पोस्टरस पे दिथ तो तुम हेकू पोस्टरन पे तम इन्फॉर्मेशन रटित तो तथ पे ज्यादा यहंदिस बारस मज जानित तो बे अस कत कर खतर या इन सत इंटरेक्ट कर खतर आज प्रोफेसर इद्रीसा यम वारिया टाइम छो तुह वुचमत सैनिस पैनलन पे सान प्रोग्रामन सत जुड़ान तथ पे कत करान अस आगही दिवान तो वारिया ज्यादा शुक्रिया इद्रीसा बाजी तुहद इन खतर Greg and Brice, a very warm welcome to both of you. We are really happy that you've joined us today and we shall be starting the discussion. And अगर मोहतरम नाजरीन तो कह ते सवाल यम सातन यमन सतन कथ करान यम इदरीसा बाजी तम करन यमन अंग्रेज पे सवाल यम सन मोहतरम नाजरीन यम प्रेफर करान कि करो कशर पे कथ चूंकि यमन कशर तगान कि मोन रोल आज टोटल कि यम तम अहम कथ वन तम कशर पे सन तम नाजरीन यम पसंद करान कि करो कशर पे कथ तमन तम सह कशर पे वातन Idrisa Baji, thank you so very much for joining. And now over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Tawseef sir. Shukriya tuhand for a wonderful overview and an introduction. Inshallah, is karab kushish ki is kath baat roiz sarni khatir mufeed. Welcome to you, Brice and Brother Waleed and Brother Brice. Wonderful to have you both here. It's an excellent opportunity to interact with you, given your many, many years of experience in the area of addiction. So I think where I would like us to start our conversation is help us understand and our audience understand what addiction really is and how does it function. So Brice, if you could kindly speak to it as an expert psychotherapist, social worker, person who's been really in the trenches for many, many years. And then Brother Waleed will turn to you about your experience, in the field of addiction, as well as your personal experience. So let's start with Brice.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I've thought a lot about the addiction and how that affects people in Kashmir, and see how people are struggling with addiction in Kashmir. One of the things that is the reason for people becoming addicted is called trauma. And trauma are experiences that we did not expect to have in our life. Something that completely jars our whole being, our whole sense of who we are and how the world is made. And that kind of thing is always a part of an addiction struggle. So it leaves the person helpless. So when one starts to talk to people who are struggling with an addiction, the trauma starts to unfold, maybe over many, many sessions. And initially, the person will just tell you a little bit about what they've experienced, but it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. So for some of the people I've experienced, they came from dysfunctional families where maybe their father was abusive to them or their mother was not nurturing them. They may have been a part of a sexual abuse experience. Two of the men I was thinking about were in the Vietnam War and ended up killing people in the Vietnam War. They weren't there to kill people. They were there as translators from Quebec who went into the war to help out the Americans and ended up doing some killing people, which they did not expect to do. So the struggle is always something horrific has happened and it doesn't fit with the way you think life is. And so addiction begins to help you deal with the pain, the deep and profound pain that's in your life. So these memories and these nightmares and these horrible things come into your mind, And what do? You try to find it and get rid of them. You use alcohol, you use drugs, you use any kind of thing. Some people eat, overeat. We have two ways of dealing with it. One is a substance addiction, which would be like drugs and alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. Another one is um, where you have a process addiction. You do something that helps you alleviate the pain. And we people will say, well, why don't you just say no? The thing of it is that the pain is so deep and so profound and so crazy that you have to have something that just gives you relief for a little while. You may even know that the pain's going to come back, but at least you have relief for a short period of time. I think I'll leave it there and let um, Greg Waleed kind of talk a little bit more about his experience of addiction.
Thank you, Brice. And Brother Waleed, how do you understand addiction? And can you relate to our audience both as to different forms of addiction and trauma that Brice spoke about, and also a little bit of your story, which we will get into a bit later as well. Thank you.
Okay. My understanding of addiction, and this is from personal experience, is that we don't see it so much as at the end of the spectrum where it was an intense event that got us there. That is certainly a problem that happens for a lot of people. But much of the background of addiction is a slow buildup of small trauma events that leaves us not comfortable in our own skin. I can't stress that enough. If I'm not comfortable being me or who I think I am, any kind of solution that fixes that is a solution I will turn to. As an addicted person, I will come back to anything that makes that discomfort go away. It doesn't have to be a glaring, obvious pain. We don't always see that. It can be very, very deep in our minds that there's a problem. So all an addicted person senses is they want some kind of relief. And I know this from personal experience, having been there. The thing that people who say just say no don't realize is that drugs were not my problem. Drugs were my solution. I was not comfortable in who I was. I had big egotistical visions of who I should be and an inferiority complex on the inside. And you can't bridge that gap. Something has to fix it. The only fix we find if we don't have help is a fix of some kind. It can be a shot of whiskey, it can be a hit off of a crack pipe, or a needle full of heroin. By the grace of Allah, I never got to needles, but I had my addiction problem. Just for your information, cocaine was my drug of non-choice, and I was there for many years. It took some serious help from the 12-step program to get me off of that world. So I know how people get there and what they're like when they are there because I have been down that path. The trauma that gets people to that point can vary. There's every kind imaginable. There is no one single key to addiction. It can be, as said, bad home life when you're a child. It can be going to Vietnam and anything in between and things we don't even want to think about. And we bury these things in the back of our mind. It is very, very common denial technique among human beings to push this stuff down. And that stuff we push down instead of facing it will come back one way or another. And it usually comes back as discomfort and rejection of the life we are leaving. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass on to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Brice and Brother Waleed. And I'll have Tausif Sab summarize it in Kashmiri quickly.
Thank you very much, Baji, Brice, and Waleed. Mohtaram Nazreen, मैक्सिमम तो आस फिक्र तौर पर कि यमो क्या वोन अलबत्ता अगर इस गूज वुचो यमन दोनवेन हिज यमो जवाब दित या युस यमो पनुन पर्सपेक्टिव दित या ड्रग एडिक्शनस पेट युंद वनुन कि ड्रग एडिक्शन छन प्रॉब्लम छन ड्रग एडिक्शन की प्रॉब्लम छ असली आसान मुसीबत युस इंसानस छ इवान जिंदगी हिंदन मुख्तलिफ पहलुवन मजन मुसीबत छुन अके हाल इवान की फॉर इंस्टेंस अगर इस कत करो कि यम छ अमरीकास मजन या कैनेडास मज या बे कुन जाय यमन हिंद मुसीबतुक एक्सपीरियंस छ वारिया डिफरेंट बमुकाबल यम मुसीबत इस कशीर मजन वुचान छ तो युस सन लुख छ मुख्तलिफ चाहे सु गरस मज छ मुसीबत चाहे सु नेबर सनिस माशरस मज छ मुसीबत चाहे सु माली मुसीबत छ जानी मुसीबत छ या परेशानी यम अस या जुल्म यम हिसाब अस पन्ने जिंदगी मजन हर मनु तुई रोजमर्रा जिंदगी मजन वुचान छ युहुंद मानुन छ कि फ्रॉम देयर एक्सपीरियंस कि यह मुसीबत आसान युस अकिस इंसानस छ वातनावान ड्रग्सन तामत ड्रग्स छन प्रॉब्लम की प्रॉब्लम छ आसान कि युस इंसानस असल पट मुसीबत छ आमुत ड्रग्स क्या करान तथ चीजस मजन ड्रग्स छ अमिस युस यह दग छ अमिस अंदर या युस अमिस यह परेशानी छ अंदर या युस यमन यह जहनी जिस्मानी इज़्तिराब छ आसान तथ तथ चीजस छ तम हिसाब सु कम करान या अक हिसाब छ यमन सु मदहोश करान कि यमन छन यीतिस टाइमस यम सु ड्रग छ करान यमन छुन बासान तम सातन सु मुसीबत की गो अम हिसाब छ यह कि अक हिसाब तम तम मुसीबत निशन तम परेशानी निश तम दग निशन दूर गसनुक युस इलाज यमन तम सातन बासान सु आसान ड्रग तो ड्रग छन प्रॉब्लम कि यहज नजर मजन प्रॉब्लम छ यम मुसीबत छ यथे कनत अस यम वलीद छ तम पन जर्नी पन सफर वनान कि कित कनत यम ते अथ मजन मुलविस या अमिक शिकार बनेमित क्योंकि जिंदगी मजन किम प्रॉब्लम्स आस यमो पन्निस बारस मज क्या ओस सोचमुत या तम पतन गो क्या कित कन इन्फीरियोरिटी इथे कन अना कित कन छ यम मुख्तलिफ चीज जिंदगी मजन अख तजब्जुब करान क्रिएट पत कित कन छ यमो कोकेन कित कन क्या करान पत अल्लाह ताला सुंद करम नंबर वन यमन ईमान रोशनी आई या मिल्लत-ए-इस्लामी युस इदार छ तमिक 12 स्टेप प्रोग्राम कि कित कन हेक अख फर्द युस यह वबा छ ड्रग्सन हुन तम निशन दूर गसित यथ पे इंशाअल्लाह बे करो तफसीलन कत अलबत्ता अकै गूज युस मे बासान छ युस द्राय अम मजन सु कि मुख्तलिफ किस्मिक मुसीबत यम छ तिम छ मे बी दहो मजन आसन 8 शख्सन तिमे चीज निवान ड्रग्सन कुन क्योंकि तत बासान कि अम दग निशन चलनुक युस यह थोड़ा टेम्पररी इलाज सु ड्रग्सन हज शक्ल मजन इवान What do you think about this, Baji?
Yes, alhamdulillah. Thank you very much for that great summary. So I think staying with the idea of trauma and oppression, both Brice and Greg, I would like to first ask, what sort of pain do addicts, let's get a little bit deeper, from a psychotherapeutic perspective. Obviously, everybody's pain is different. Obviously, every story is different. So we can't say Brother Waleed's story is everybody's story. So therefore, I think, what are the different kinds of traumas that, when you have encountered people who are struggling with addiction, and from a psychotherapeutic perspective, from a social work perspective, how does one first recognize it, and then how do we respond and humanize this individual that may be struggling?
Well, I would say, first of all, we have to recognize one thing, that addiction isn't just a personal issue. It's also a systemic or a societal issue. That what is allowed to go on in the society, like whether it's kind of oppressive things that are happening from military or police, whether it's the fact that there are so many drugs in the society, the fact that people don't recognize. I was thinking of one of the people I've been working with, who is a part of what we call in Canada a baby scoop, where Indigenous children were taken away from their families and put in foster care and adopted care. He never knew who he was. He wasn't like the family that he was part of, but he didn't know how to deal with that, and he didn't have any deep sense of spirituality, so he didn't know who he was. And so the process of not knowing who he was, which was a deep and profound pain in his life, led him to drink alcoholic beverages and get drunk because that stopped it. It led him then to go on and take some drugs. It led him to try to stop everything and be married and have a couple of kids. And then the pain came back because he hadn't dealt with it. And then he got into things in Toronto with drugs and wrong, gangs and that sort of stuff. But part of it is, I just want to emphasize, part of it is that something happened to him, which was something society did. It could be something that happened in your own family or something. Second of all, there weren't people who knew what was going on. He was never able to tell, I just don't fit in. I just don't fit in. And then he got into drugs and alcohol. He got worse going on. And finally, he said, he finally found a place where he could go and get treatment for addiction. And then he had to go and find out who he was as an indigenous person, and went to indigenous lodges and some other things to find out who he is. But that whole process of it gets deeper and it compounds. The initial shame, the initial just deep and profound pain of not knowing who he was after he was jerked away from his family, and then as a young child, and then becoming an adult and getting into crazy stuff and being in prison a couple of times, and then it just kept on. Addiction gets deeper and crazier and more profound because the person has not found a solution to it. And one of the things that we need to do, and we can talk about this in a few minutes as well, is how do we start to recognize that something's going on? And it isn't about a person just saying no. It's about other people saying, what happened to you? Where are you going? Or a person who also has struggled with addiction say, it looks like you're struggling with an addiction. Can we talk about that? Can I tell you my story a little bit? And can we move forward? And then the whole process of recovery deals with something social as well, because it has to be done with other people. You cannot do it alone. You don't have the energy to get rid of an addiction by yourself. A few people do, but it's very, very rare.
Thank you very much, Brice. I think it's very, very important for us to understand that it is a systemic issue, and it's not just a personal or an individual issue. And many, many societal factors and even factors within one's own life, they inform where a person ends up. Brother Waleed, you mentioned earlier the struggle of not knowing who you are, which really leads people down a very dangerous path. Could you speak a little bit more about that? The struggle of finding one's own identity, struggling with one's own identity, or struggling with all of the other systemic factors that Brice outlined, and creating a balance between the two. What are some of those issues?
Not knowing who I am is not the problem I experience. It's not accepting who I am versus who I think I am. That was my personal experience. Again, the best description I've ever heard of is from an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I'm an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. That was very much my experience. I did not fit into the society I lived in. I always saw your shiny car and my withered soul. I was always less than you. I was always separate from you. And that was before I started doing drugs. Once I took some medicine, that feeling faded away. The facts didn't change, but the feeling faded away. It was Novocaine for the soul. Anybody who's been to the dentist understands how good Novocaine is if they're about to drill into your tooth. Well, we have pains in our souls, and drugs act like Novocaine. Of course, it's going to wear off, and the pain's going to be worse when it does. What happens is like a fire. Once we start habitually using drugs, we continue to feel less than, and now to an extent we have become less than. We've amplified the effect. Used to be it was just, I don't quite fit in. Now it's, I'm an addict, or I got this drug problem. And that, you can't put that flame out all by yourself. The same brain that got me into the problem isn't going to lead me out of the problem. We have to have help. But before we can get help, we have to admit that we have a problem. And that is a big step for every addict. We
I would
first,
just, yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead,
I would
Brice.
just want to say that for me and all my work, when you mention soul, we forget that addiction is a spiritual issue, that your soul has been damaged, that there's a deep and profound experience or set of experiences. And for you, it was either stigma or being shamed by who you were. But it can be all kinds of things that our soul is ruptured. And we have a hard time loving other people. We don't believe that other people love us. We don't feel like we fit in the world, which is also a spiritual issue, because we don't feel the world is a good place. And then we have a difficult time with any kind of a higher power, God, Allah, other way of defining higher power, because we are totally unacceptable with this ruptured soul. That's why AA is so powerful, but we can go on to something else.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, again, as you both outlined, we need to look at addiction not as a problem of a person or a particular individual, but as a systemic societal problem. And therefore, the response also has to be systemic and at the social level. Tausif sir, would you mind summarizing? You're on mute.
Thank you for reminding me. Varia shukriya baji. Mein khayal yos varia interesting कि उस दोनों Brice तो Waleed ये वनान ٲسۍ तो ये छ ऐसे समझने ज़रूरत कि यम सातन ऐसे कत छ करान drug addiction या युस ऐसे मुंशियातन हुन मुसीबत छ सु कित कन समझो कि ये छ ऐसे समझन कि ये छ एकस मुनफरिद शख्सस problem कि निश पूरा माशरुक problem कि ये छ ऐसे मुश्तरक पठन समझन तो एमिक युस अजाल छ या एमिक युस हल छ तिम ठांडन क्योंकि अख चीज अगर ब्राइस या वलीद इत कन तम वनान कि गोडनेथ वुन कि माशरस मज यम चीज यम चीज दस्तियाब यम चीज वातन सह पन्नस पानस मज वनान कि गो अकिस बड़िस सतहस पे प्रॉब्लम यथ समझ जरूरत मे बी सानो गरो मज सानो हमसायो मज सनिस अंद पकिस मज कह लुक अत चीजस अक हिसाब तरजीह दिवान या एनेबल करनावान अगर न कहें अत चीज़ साथ दी अमुक मार्केट अमुक बाजरी रोज न गो सह समझुन दयम चीज़ यम सात इंसान मुसीबत ज़्यादा या रोमुत क्योंकि ब्राइस यम सात दयमि फिर वलीद न कथ मज आय यमो दोप कि यह सिर्फ अख जिस्मानी बेमारी यन वचन कह यह रूहानी बेमारी ये सोन रूह रोमुत यह छंडित हेकान कह अमिस पन्नस पनुन खालिक या मालिक तथ सत कनेक्शन तह रोमुत तो यह जिस्मी योतन कि यह रूह तुस बेमार गोमुत तम पतन यह वलीदिन कत अक्सर वुचान पन्ने जिंदगी मज कि क्या सूचमुत अक इंसान कि मे बी ये बह बोर्ड गस ये बह कॉलेज वात या यूनिवर्सिटी वात या ये बह बिजनेस कर शुरू बह क्या कर हासिल बह क्या आस लुकन मज क्या आस मोन या ब्याक दपान कि मे बेक सज चमक वन गाड़ अथ तो पन छुनमुत पान मे अथ तम चीजन वातनोनस बह तथ ताम तो यह हाव भाव या बेकिस सतन पन पान मुकाबल कर सो अनह आसन या इनफीरियरिटी पन्नस पानस मज तम चीज रावरावान सो तथ चीजस रिलेटेड पत अगर वो कि गूज क्या द्राय यह कथ कि अत पूर माशरस पे यमिस इंसानस रूह जहन यूतः कमजोर गोमुत यम यह वातनो ड्रग्सन ताम तमिस इंसानस निश हेको यह उम्मीद कर कि सुई रूह तो सुई जहन कड़ अमिस अम चीज मज नबर क्योंकि सह अत मज ऑलरेडी मुलविस गोमुत सह रोमुत अत चीजस मज तवे अत मज कि यह माशरी प्रॉब्लम यह मुश्तरक पे सारवीन अकिस पलजुन तो अम मज नबर नेरनिक तिम अकदाम तुलन नंबर वन कि अमिच दस्तियाबी यह लुकन तामत वातान गो सह सारे खुद बड़ प्रॉब्लम अकिस माशरस मज कि यह माशर कुन नत कुन तरीक अत मज मुलविस दयम चीज वन बिचार अत मुसीबतस मज अत मसलस मज आव हेन तमिस मजन छन पत तीचा कुवत आसान कि सु नेर योत्ताम न तमिस साथ दिमो तमिस छन ठोकर लगावन की तमिस छन दर दर करन की सु इंसान छ रटुन तमिस छ पलजुन तो सु छ एम मजन नेबर कड़न एम मुसीबत मजन नेबर कड़न तो मैंने अकली मुताबिक मैंने कम अकली हिसाब द्राय ये गूश युस दोनों अस ब्राइस तो ग्रेग वनान अस आज
Shukriya Tausif sahab, certainly shukriya tuhan. When Paka was brought, iskara when kahtki, when specifically kya haka iskarit. Magar time brought principal iman badalak sawal. So Brice and Waleed, I just want to ask you, how do we humanize an addict? So we've talked about systemic issue. So, recognizing that it is not just an individual problem, it is a systemic issue, and we need to have a systemic response. The most important thing is, how do we remove the stigma and how do we humanize someone who is already fallen into some form of addiction? And again, both from a spiritual level as well as societal level. How do we do this? What are some of the things that we need to be mindful of? What has worked and what doesn't work? I'll start with you, Brice.
Well, first of all, we need to make sure our language is, this is a person with an addiction. This is not an addict. That's not his whole definition. He still is a father or a husband, a brother, a worker, whatever it is. So it's a person with an addiction. And we need to sort of separate that because we want to get back to the personhood of who this person is, a person who is a father, say. And I think one of the things for me has been that the person meets other people who are also struggling with an addiction. And he meets those other people in a safe place. My experience has been that when people attended Alcoholics Anonymous, they started to see other people who had similar problems. They'd always thought they were completely different than everybody else, but they're not. We all are human beings, and sometimes some of us get into addictive patterns. And when you start to hear somebody tell a story that's like your story or has similarities to your story, you start to see yourself as a person with an addiction. It's not just an addict or a ne'er-do-well or however they want to talk about it. So I'd ask Greg to follow up. But the first, I like AA so much because you go to where other people are like you and they're also struggling with the same problems. They have the cravings and you can talk about that. The thing I like about it in terms of what I talked about with Idrissa is that the only people who attend an AA meeting are fellow people who have an addiction. If you don't have an addiction, you're not welcome. If you're a professional, you're not welcome. If you're family members, you're not welcome. There may be Al-Anon for those who are family members to help them understand it. But in some ways, it's almost a liberation society underneath the regular society. And I think people who are not a part of that addictive culture are not asked to come in.
Thank you for that. And you've already started introducing us to Alcoholics Anonymous. Do you want to, for those who may not know much about it, do you want to just tell us what that program is?
I can say a bit about it, and then Greg can talk about the Muslim version. Very few people knew what to do with people who were struggling with an addiction. The only thing they did is they sent them to the hospital and had them dry out. Well, after they dried out and were back on the street again, pretty soon the pain and what we call cravings started to come up. And when those cravings came, they went out and used again. So Bill W. Was the first one to start to look at what is an addiction. He himself was a person with an addiction, and he started to work at the 12 steps, which came out of Christianity, evangelical Christianity, but he reframed them so that any person from any tradition could be a part of Alcoholics Anonymous. But he only got sober when he and Dr. Bob did it together. And then there were branches in New York and around Cleveland, Ohio.
Akron,
Ohio. Yeah, Akron, Ohio. And so they together started the process. And after about 5-10 years, they eventually came up with the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, which are a pathway, not the only pathway, but a pathway to become sober and to work with other people. And I want to just say there was a friend of mine. She came to my class a number of times, and she had been sober for 20 years, but she got cancer. And she immediately thought, how do I kill the pain of knowing that I have cancer? And she said, I know how to kill that pain. I can go back to using rum and alcohol and all that kind of stuff. But she said, then I thought, I've told everybody, just make a telephone call to a friend who's also a part of AA. And she did that. She didn't drink, and she died sober. I mean, a number of years later. So, this thing does not, this addiction process can come up again and can be triggered anytime you experience a lot of pain, because you know what the answer is to pain.
Thank you, Brice. Brother Waleed, now would you kindly introduce us to Millat-e-Islami, which is the Islamic version of the Alcoholics Anonymous, and briefly tell us about the 12 steps as well as the 12 traditions from an Islamic perspective. And Tawsif is going to put links to the Millat-e-Islami website where people can find out more about it. But if you can introduce us to what the Millat-e-Islami program is, how accessible that is, and how people can participate, and what message does it convey?
Thank you. I want to address one of the questions that has been on the table is, why don't you just say no? The difference between, for example, a heavy drinker and an alcoholic is this. A heavy drinker can put the bottle down, walk away, and never pick it up again just because he's tired of it. As an addict or as an addicted person or an alcohol addicted person, there may come a point in time when I decide I don't want to do this anymore, and I discover to my horror that I can't stop. Or to put it another way, I can stop, but stopping is easy. Not starting again is hard. That was my experience all through my addictive years. And I could go into that in more detail, but that's not the immediate question. The next immediate question is, how do we humanize the addicted person?
Yes.
Let's focus on that for a moment. Here in the US, anybody can walk into a liquor store and buy a bottle of whiskey. And it's not very difficult to walk across the tracks and buy something stronger, and it's not legal. Here in our Islamic societies, we have an interesting and completely different problem. Nobody talks about alcohol or drugs. That's a problem over there in the West. They have that problem. Our kids won't be getting into drugs. They're Muslims. I've seen that here in the States. When I start to bring Millat-e-Islami to Masajid, a lot of our immigrant parents say, well, we don't have that problem. We're Muslims. I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, but that's not the way it works. They're going to Western schools. They're going to be discovering Western vices. You do have this problem. It just may not be in your face yet. So what we need to do first is get the Islamic parents to understand this is a problem. It does exist, and it is an illness. It is not your kids rejecting Islam. They're not just being disobedient. They have caught a known illness. If we can make that transition in the parents' minds from vice to illness, this is an illness. We understand the psychological roots that make addiction possible for a person. Let's keep focusing on the fact that it is an illness. There is even an identified gene that makes it more likely for a person to become an addict. Scientists have identified a specific gene. If you have that particular gene, you're more likely to become addicted. You can become addicted if you don't have it, and you can stay sober if you do have it, but it changes the probabilities. That tells us that it is a medical problem, not just a personal vice problem. So to personalize the addict, make sure the entire society has to understand that it's an illness. It may not be COVID-19, but it is an illness, and in its own way, it is contagious. Moving on to Millat-e-Islami, I'll give you some history. As Brother Brice has already said, Alcoholics Anonymous started in about 1935 and came up with the 12 steps and published the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. That book helped some people get sober even without outside help. They just had the book, they read it, and they started following the instructions, and it helped them address their own problems. But you usually need another person. That is just the nature of our illness. When time went by, there were people that realized that I have a problem that isn't alcohol. And the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is alcohol, 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 because that was the major problem in the US at the time. But then we had the surprise in the 70s and 80s called cocaine. Cocaine spread out of Florida and like wildfire all over the country. A group got together in California and decided we need a drug-specific version of the 12 steps, and they invented Cocaine Anonymous. That went on for a while and still continues to this day and doing good work. But then another group realized we need a non-drug specific group. Doesn't matter if you're using alcohol, cocaine, heroin, or what have you, we need something that will address the generic problem of being an addicted person. And they founded Narcotics Anonymous. This is like a set of chapters in the Bible where something begot something begot something. Well, Narcotics Anonymous was working for quite a while and still is to this day. It's got meetings all over the world. In the late 80s, a man by the name of Zaid Amani came out of prison and had straightened up his own life using 12-step programs. And he started to notice something. Other people had gotten Islam in jail or had gone into jail as Muslims. They had been addicts and they came out clean, and very soon they fell back into addiction. And the reason he found was a lot of them says, well, I can't go to AA. It's all Christian and they all say the Lord's Prayer. So he realized that we need a religiously specific 12-step group. And it wasn't like we had to pull things up by the roots and, cut new doors. The 12 steps are Islam, just coded in a slightly different way than we're used to. We start with, I have to admit that I have a problem. And that's not just some mental vagueness. Admit, if you see the word admit on a ticket at the movie theater, it means they have to let you in. When I admit that I'm an addicted person, I have to let that truth into my heart. All right? It isn't just a problem I have. It is right now a problem that I am. And I can pull it back out, but I can only do that with help. The next step is to come to believe that we can clean up our lives with the help of a higher power. So far, there's nothing here that contradicts Islam. And the steps go on. I'm going to use up all my time if I go through all of them. But step number 3 is we made a decision to turn our lives and our will over to a higher power. I believe that could be rephrased as submitting our words and our deeds to Allah. And that's exactly what we have to do again. We thought we did that as Muslims, but we haven't really done it. And the 12 steps help us to get rid of what's stopping us from doing it. Go ahead.
One thing before you go on too far is I'd like to go back to the first step again in the Millat-e-Islami, because it says we admitted that we were neglectful of our higher selves, like we've been in this rut. We're not who we really are when we're in this rut, and that our lives have become unmanageable because of the addiction. We can't manage this life anymore, and we've negated ourselves. And I think that's such an important step, because you're now shamed and you're stigmatized and you live in that world and you do crap that you shouldn't be doing. So I just want to emphasize that, because I really appreciate it. I don't think it's in the AA so much. They say our lives have become unmanageable because of our addictive patterns, but that higher self is so important in the Millat-e-Islami.
Thank you, Brother Brice.
Thank you very, very much for this excellent summary. There's a lot here to cover, and I'm sure Tasifsa will do justice to it. But I think the crux of it really is that we treat this problem both as a physical illness, a mental illness, but also a psychological loss of some sort or a spiritual loss of some sort. So I'll let Tasifsa do a bit of translation.
Thank you very much. Too many balls for me to juggle right now. तो مےٚ چھُ باسان کہِ اگر أسۍ وٕچھو زٕ واریاہ اِمپاٹنٹ یا زٕ واریاہ اہم پہلوٗ گٔے اُجاگر یُس پٔتِم سوال یُس باجی پرٛژھ یِمن کہِ نمبر ون ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ أسۍ أکِس ایڈِکٹ تُہۍ ؤنتو کانٛہہ شرٲبۍ یا چرسی یا بیٚیہِ کانٛہہ یُس یہِ مُنشیاتُک مٔریض چھُ آسان بنیومُت ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ أسۍ تٔمِس کُن وٕچھان چھِ کہِ أسۍ کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ کرو پنُن یُس پہلوٗ یا یُس نظر چھِ تِمن وٕچھنٕچ یِتھ کٔنۍ أسۍ اگر پننہِ معاشرٕچ کتھ کرو أسۍ کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ چھِ وٕچھان تِمن کہِ تِمن چھِ سٲری دوٗر گژھان تِم تِتھۍ شخص یِوان واریاہ نیٖچ نظرِ وٕچھنہٕ گوٚو تِم چھِ اینی ویز گژھان پتھ 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 کہِ برعکس ییٚمہِ کہِ تِمن یِہے پلزنہٕ یا تِم یِہن اپناونہٕ تہٕ امہِ نِش ہٮ۪کو نٮ۪بر کٔڑِتھ تِمن چھُ واپس دکے یِوان دِنہٕ کہِ تِم گژھن واریاہ زیادٕ أتھۍ منٛز کہِ أسۍ کیٛاہ ہیٚچھو یِہنٛدِ ایٚکسپیٖرینس نِش کہِ یِتھٮ۪ن لُکن سۭتۍ کِتھ کٔنۍ کرو ڈیٖل پنٕنۍ نظر کِتھ کٔنۍ بدلاوو أسۍ تِمن ییٚمہِ حِساب أسۍ مُخٲطب چھِ گژھان تِمن سۭتۍ یِتھ کٔنۍ أسۍ کتھ چھِ کران یا تِہُنٛد یِتھ کٔنۍ أسۍ ذِکر چھِ کران تتھ منٛز کِتھ کٔنۍ انو تبدیٖلی ییٚمہِ سۭتۍ تِہنٛزِ زندگی منٛز اکھ پازٹِو اثر ہیٚکہِ پٮ۪تھ تتھ منٛز اوس کہِ اکھ واریاہ اہم چیٖز یُس درٛاو کہِ اَسہِ پَزِ سمجھُن کہِ تِم چھِ اِنسان ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ أسۍ أکِس یُس مُنشیاتُک مٔریض چھُ آسان اگر أسۍ تٔمِس صرف وٕچھو ایز شرٲبۍ ایز چرسی ایز کوکین کرن وول سُہ چھُ واریاہ پرابلم اَسہِ چھُ گۄڈنٮ۪تھ یہِ زانُن نمبر ون کہِ یہِ چھُ کٲنٛسہِ ہُنٛد اولاد یہِ تہِ چھُ کٲنٛسہِ ہُنٛد لۄکتہٕ جِگر یہِ چھُ کٲنٛسہِ ہُنٛد مول یہِ چھُ کٲنٛسہِ ہٕنٛز موج یہِ چھُ کٲنٛسہِ ہُنٛد بوے کٲنٛسہِ ہٕنٛز بیٚنہِ تہٕ یُس یِمن یہِ مسلہٕ چھُ یہِ چھُ پرابلم یہِ چھِ اکھ بٮ۪مٲرۍ یُس یِمن چھِ یہِ اِنسان چھُنہٕ صرف شرٲبی یوتن کینٛہہ أمِس پٔتۍ کِنۍ چھِ واریاہ بٔڑ اکھ ساکھ اکھ شناخت تتھ چیٖزس سُہ چیٖز چھُ تھاوُن اَسہِ نظرن منٛز گوٚو نمبر ون سُہ نمبر سیکنڈ یُس ولیٖدن پویِنٹ تُل سُہ چھُ اَسہِ خٲطرٕ واریاہ زیادٕ اہم روزان کہِ ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ أسۍ کٔشیٖرِ ہٕنٛز کتھ چھِ کران اکثر یِم اَسہِ پرٛٲنۍ پروگرام تہِ کٔرۍ ڈرگ ایڈِکشنس پٮ۪ٹھ پٔتمیو 2-2 ؤرۍیو پٮ۪ٹھ اکثر چھِ أسۍ وَنان کہِ اَسہِ چھُ ڈِنایل کیاہ چھُ آسان کہِ ییٚلہِ اَسہِ مول موج چھُ وَنان أسۍ چھِ کٲشِر یا اَسہِ چھِ کٔشیٖر پِروٲر اَسہِ چھےٚ نہٕ یہِ پرابلم یا سون شُر ہیٚکہِ نہٕ کٔرتھٕے یہِ اگر تِمن وَنان چھِ کہِ واچ کٔرِو بچس پٮ۪ٹھ تھٲیِو نظر تھوڑا ٲسِو وٕچھان یِہُنٛد بیگ یِمن منٛز وٕچھِو تبدیٖلی أسۍ چھِ بالکل سُہ ژھٕنان مٲنِو تُہۍ رد کٔرِتھ کہِ نہ سون شُر ہیٚکہِ نہٕ کٔرتھٕے یوٚتامَتھ سُہ اتھ چیٖزس منٛز ووتمُت چھُ آسان أسۍ چھِ صرف أتھۍ کُن آسان تہٕ ولیٖد سُنٛد وَنُن تہِ اوس یِہُے کہِ اَسہِ پَزِ یہِ زانُن کہِ یہِ چھِ اکھ واریاہ بٔڑ بٮ۪مٲرۍ تہٕ یُس یہِ مغربیت اَسہِ منٛز ژامٕژ چھِ چاہے سُہ سانیو فونو دٔسۍ چھِ یا اَکہِ حِساب یُس أزیُک معاشرٕ چھِ أسۍ وٕچھان کہِ اگر مغربیت چھِ اَسہِ ژامُت مغربی کلچر چھِ اَسہِ ژامُت تٔتھۍ سۭتۍ سۭتۍ یُس تِم چھِ پرابلم چھِ تِم تہِ چھِ اژان اَسہِ منٛز پتہٕ أسۍ مُسلمان چھِ یا مُسلمان چھِنہٕ کِہیٖنۍ اسی لیے پَزِ اَسہِ گۄڈنٮ۪تھ یہِ ایٚکسیپٹ کَرُن ایڈمِٹ کَرُن کہِ یہِ پرابلم ہیٚکہِ سانٮ۪ن شُرٮ۪ن تہِ گٔژھِتھ سانٮ۪ن گرن اندر تہِ وٲتِتھ گوٚو نمبر ون سُہ نمبر سیکنڈ اوس پتہٕ یُس یِہنٛدۍ اِدارٕ چھِ تتھ پٮ۪ٹھ وَنان ایلکوہولِکس انانمس برایس ٲسۍ تمہِ کِس بارس منٛز وَنان تمیُکُے یُس مُسلمان ؤرجن چھُ سُہ چھُ مِلت-اِ-اِسلامی یُس امریکاہس منٛز آو 1960 اراوُنڈ اَسہِ خٲطرٕ چھُنہٕ ایلکوہولِکس انانمس تیوٗتاہ ضروٗری کینٛہہ تہٕ أسۍ کرو مِلت-اِ-اِسلامی یُس اَسہِ ولید ٲسۍ وٕنکیٚنس وَنان کیونکہِ یِم چھِ دۄنوے ہِوی البتہ مِلت-اِ-اِسلامی چھِ یُس مُسلمانن خٲطرٕ آو بناونہٕ ساروی کھۄتہٕ اہم چیٖز یِمو یُس دوٚپ کہِ اتھ منٛز چھِ 12 قدم آسان کہِ یُس أکِس فردس خٲطرٕ واریاہ اہم چھُ کیونکہِ پرابلم چھنہٕ کہِ اکھ فرد آو چرس شراب یا کوکینس کُن گوٚو پتہٕ ترووُن ساروی کھۄتہٕ بٔڑ پرابلم چھِ ترٲیِتھ بیٚیہِ نہٕ واپس تتھ کُن گژھُن کینٛہہ یُس أسۍ وٕچھان تہِ چھِ کہِ أسۍ چھِ رِہیب سینٹرس نِوان یا ہسپتال چھِ نِوان 2 رٮ۪تھ 3 رٮ۪تھ 4 رٮ۪تھ چھُ سون بچہِ روزان سوبر یا ڈراے روزان مگر ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ واپس چھُ یِوان رِلیپس 10 منٛز چھِ 9 لُکن گژھان رِلیپس اتھ کُن سُہ رِلیپس کِتھ کٔنۍ بچاوو أسۍ تتھ منٛز چھِ یِم دپان کہِ یُس مِلت-اِ-اِسلامی یُس چھِ اتھ منٛز چھِ یِم دپان 12 قدم کیاہ چھِ نمبر 1 گۄڈنیٚتھٕے تسلیٖم کرُن کہِ مےٚ ہسا چھےٚ پرابلم مےٚ چھِ روحٲنی تہِ یہِ پرابلم جسمٲنی تہِ یہِ پرابلم تہٕ دوٚیِم چیٖز چھِ تتھ منٛز سمجھُن کہِ أسۍ کمہِ مقصد چھِ اللہ تعالیٰ ہن یتھ دُنیاہس منٛز سوٗزمٕتۍ کہِ اَسہِ چھا یہِ دُنیا صرف بالکل تِتھے کٔنیتھ کہِ من چاہی زندگی چھِ اَسہِ کِنہٕ اَسہِ چھِ اکھ واریاہ بوٚڑ آرڈر اکھ تہِ दुनियाहस मज हकूकुल इबाद तो हकूकुल्लाह तम हिसाब पन जिंदगी बितावन अच्छा अमर बिल मारूफ या नहीं अनिल मुनकर तिमन तिथन यम प्रिंसिपल असूल जिंदगी बितावन तिमन पे पकन जरूरत तिम 10 स्टेप मे लिंक्स कर शेयर यमन कमेंटन मज इंशाल्लाह तुम हेकू तिम 10 स्टेप बाय स्टेप वचित अलबत्ता गूज तमिच यह नेरान कि पन पान गस अल्लाह ताला सिंद यम ते अहकामात तिमन पे पुशरावन सु तस्लीम करुन बरक्स यम कि इंसान समझी कि बुस ऑल इन ऑल तो ये यह कि बह कर तिथे कन पन जिंदगी बसर यम सात अल्लाह ताला सरेंडर इंसान पन पान कर अल्लाह ताला सज वत तो अल्लाह ताला सदन अहकामन पुशरावान पन पान वलीद सुंद वन कि सारे खुद बोड़ कदम तो सारे खुद बोड़ स्टेप अम चीज इंसान अत मज बे पत मुलविस गसान तम नश बचन खतर रूहानी पन पान परवरदिगार आलमीन सतन जोड़न सारे खुद बोड़ तथ मज सल्यूशन
शुक्रिया तौसीफ साहब ज़ कथ हेक बह एडिशनल वनित अथ मुतलक अख छु ये कि मिलत इस्लामी यम जन यम पोस्टर्स यस इंफॉर्मेशन छ सन कोशिश छ कि अस करो ये तर्जम अथ अस करो तोहि सारने इंशाल्लाह प्रोवाइड पेंड ऑनलाइन के थ्रू उर्दू पठन सो इंशाल्लाह सु वैसे हालस छु तोहि अंग्रेज लिंक्स छु तोहि तिम हेकिव तुई डाउनलोड करिथन तो इंशाल्लाह उम्मीद है कि तुम हेकिव सु तम निश थोड़ा सा फायदे इख्तियार करित दयम चीज युस जन मिलत इस्लामी एसेंशियल पॉइंट सारे को जरूरी चीज छ अत मज छुन कंसे बेस इंसान सुन दखल आसान कहीं थी यमिस ये बेमार लजमस आसी यमिस कि युस कि अत मज मुलविस गोमुत छु तमिस छु पान ये कदम तुलन मगर कुनी जनी ते हेकि तुलित तो मगर ज्यादा इफेक्टिव रोजान ज्यादा अमुक असर ठीक रोजान अगर तम अकि खुद ज्यादा ग्रुप बनावन तो यमन कॉमनली अगर 2 नफर यमन कुनी प्रॉब्लम या 3 नफर 4 नफर कंस हिंद सुपरविजन वराई मेलन तम यकजा गसन अकिस बेस सत पन कहानी शेयर करन तो पत पाने कदम तुलन यम 10 स्टेप्स यम जन मिलत इस्लामियस मज तम कि मदद सतन हेकन तम इंशाल्लाह बेमार नश दूर गसित coming back to our discussion, there are a number of other things, but I think it would be very important for us to come up with some concrete steps based on your experience, both Brice and Waleed. You know, what is the role of teachers? What is the role of parents? And particularly, what is the role of religious leaders, imams? You know, and how can they all form that supportive system, societally speaking, in order to help people overcome this illness? I'll start with you, Brice.
Well, there were, I was thinking of a number of things as we were talking. In therapy, we use 2 things. One is called stages of change. And I think one of the most important parts of it is that too often our language with a person who's struggling with addiction is accusatory or stigmatizing. We have to find out where that person is, what he or she is thinking, where they would like to be in their lives, rather than immediately being somewhat accusatory or whatever. We have to admit that we may be hurt by some things that they've done, but we also have to be very careful that we find out what the cues are underneath. Even though they've been really distorted, their soul has been broken apart by this addiction, they still have stuff that they can start on that they would really like to do. Maybe it would be one of the guys I worked with, and some other people had a hard time with him, but he really wanted to be a good father for his sons. And so he and I talked every time I worked with him. He and I talked about what does it mean to be a father. And some of the other guys had trouble with him because he wasn't the most pleasant person in the world around the house. But he and I talked about this father stuff. And that father stuff is what was, he worked so he would be a person that he could be the father he wanted to be. It wasn't that I was imposing that on him. I just kept asking him questions about being a father and what he thought and where he was coming from, because that was where his change would start to come. And then he would do other things. And it goes along with another thing we do is called motivational interviewing. I look for where you want to change. not where I think you ought to change, but where you want to change. In terms of imams, first of all, realizing that for imams that addiction comes from shame and stigma and traumatic trauma experiences, terrible things that people never should even have saw. They've lost, and they have a. I like the idea of a broken soul that needs to be recovered. How do we work with them? And look at places where people are harmed and begin to talk about that in the Juma or whatever it is. Don't pretend like people aren't experiencing really crazy things. You may have to use it. You may have to use oblique language, but for a person who is struggling, or the people who are struggling with that person, oblique language catches things. I had to do a funeral for a man who was a sponsor of many, many people in AA. A sponsor is a person's like your mentor. And his mother said, I don't want any of my brothers and sisters to know that my son had a problem with addiction. So I thought, okay, what am I going to do? Because they're going to be his mentees are going to be out, or sponsees are going to be out there, and he needs to know that I respect this man and that I know what went on, and I respect those other people who are out there in the congregation at the funeral. And so I used the Serenity Prayer. I used the Lord's Prayer. I used all kinds of coded languages, which the relatives had no idea that this person was ever addicted. But the people I was speaking to got the message that they were out there. And I think we need to have to learn to do that. We need to talk about God's mercy, God's compassion. We need to talk about, I mean, in Christianity, we talk about made in the image of God. I'm not sure what that would be for people in Islam. The other thing of it is I started, one of the things I did in Christianity, and you'd have to figure out where the stigma is or whatever. A lot of people I worked with had problems and have been abused by mother or father. So I refused to use mother and father language in any prayer or in any theology that I did, because I knew that immediately it would set them off. It would make them go. And some people then later said to me, Brice, I'm all right when you pray. I'm not all right when some other people pray. At the same point, people were after me because, why don't you use father language? Why don't you use mother language? And I said, I just can't because of this, this, and this. So I think we as religious leaders need to, number one, know that there's a stigma. Number two, that it's a societal issue. Number three, that there are people out in the congregation or in the Juma or whatever who are struggling with this. And we need to use language and ideas that let them know that addiction is a disease, or addiction is not their fault. Their soul was broken. How do we help them stand in the lineup and do the prayers? Anything, but we need to give evidence. And it doesn't need to be that other people catch on to the evidence, although we should say if there are problems, like I've heard there are in Kashmir, that some people are, making drugs too available or make whatever, and that there's too much violence. Violence will lead to addiction very, very quickly. So, but we need, as religious leaders, to somehow let people know that this wasn't all their fault, that there is help, that parents can work at this, but they need to do it in such a way that they're loving and compassionate, and really listen to why this son or daughter or father or mother, whoever it is, really got into these difficult patterns of using addiction to kill the pain.
Thank you, Brice. I think you point us in an interesting and important direction, which is that language is power. And how we communicate with everybody, particularly those who are suffering, is incredibly important. So in Islam, we have the concept of ihsan, doing everything with beauty, and God is the most beautiful. So I think using beautiful language, inclusive language, rather than accusatory language, is an important aspect of how we can communicate with those who are suffering. Brother Waleed, on to you.
Where I left off was on step 3, where we decided to submit to our higher power, or as we understand in Islam, We submit our deeds and our words to Allah. That is Islam. It's packed right there into step 3 of the 12-step program, dating back all those years. The next step is the one where all the magic happens, where the work happens, where the healing happens. The addicted person needs to get some time alone, sit down with a piece of paper, and slowly and methodically write down all of the things that are bothering him. There's even a format spelled out for doing this. This is the person I'm angry at. This is what they did. This is why it affected me. This is the institution I'm mad at. This is what they did. This is how it affects me. You write this list, and as you start to write this list, you discover that it gets longer, and things start coming up from the unconscious that we think we had forgotten about. We did not forget about. I had incidents in my childhood that I have long since repressed. You can't call it physical abuse, but it left emotional scars. As I started to write down my 4th step, that's what this process is called, those things came bubbling up and I wrote them down. Just getting them down on paper shines a light on corners of our inner minds and our souls that hasn't been there in a long time. I've described this to one meeting as we have to wipe the mud off of our windshield or we can't drive straight. That is what this process does. We have to be able to see out there to the real world. Right now, as addicts or as addicted persons or as alcoholics, whatever your particular path has been, that your sickness has affected you, that person is not seeing clearly. There's mud all over the glasses, or as I said, you're driving down the road in a car and there's mud all over your windshield. That is not a place to be. That's a good way to hurt yourself and other people. When we write down all these things that we have resentments again, that's the key word in addiction, or resentments. That means technically comes from a French word that means to feel again. And it isn't just limited to negatives, but we'll come back to that at some other time. Resentments are things that we keep going over and over and over again in our mind, consciously or unconsciously, because they change how we feel about others and they change how we feel about ourselves. And we're trapped in that world and we're not seeing the real world. Getting that list written down is the first step towards healing. The next step after that is the one that everybody is afraid of. Okay, they've got this long list. They thought it was going to be half a page. It turned out to be 4 pages. Now what? We have to go to somebody who's ideally another addicted person who's been there for a while and has been clean a while. Sit down in private and spill that stuff out on the table. The important thing about all the 12-step programs is what you hear here stays here. It is a program where you can say something in total confidence and it will not be repeated. You have to find somebody you trust that much. In Islam, we call such a person a Waleed. In AA, it's called and all the other 12-step programs, it's called a mentor. Same concept. We have to find a person we trust down to the level of our soul and start talking about these problems. And what the other person's role is isn't just to listen, but to say, well, what was your part in that incident? All right. What did you do that you or didn't do that you could have done at the time? We need to understand that we're not innocent. We're sick, but we're not evil. And we have to identify where did that sickness manifest in our past. Even before we took our first drink, hit, or what have you, our illness was already there. And it manifested in some of these incidents that we're writing down. In many cases, we could have handled it better. We can't go back in time and fix it, but we need to understand what we could have done better. That comes back to us later in a different step. But once that full list is discussed with another person, we can then go and sit quietly for an hour and understand much better of who we have been and how our sickness has affected us. It is one of the most cleansing experiences anyone can ever experience. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. That was incredibly powerful and helpful. I think just to quickly summarize, the piece of self-awareness and self-reflection is a necessary step. And also the idea, I really appreciated how you put it, that admitting to oneself that we're not innocent is incredibly important. And also, ensuring that we make a distinction between being sick and not projecting it as that we are evil. So sickness is one thing, being evil is entirely different. So that was incredibly powerful. I think you highlight for us also the importance, both of you, the underlying assumption when we go to a religious leader or when we go to a mentor or when we go to someone that we trust. Trust is an essential issue. And from an Islamic perspective, trust and confidentiality is the centerpiece. So when someone comes to you, whether you're an imam or you're a social worker or you're a parent or you're a neighbor, ensuring that level of confidentiality, that it is not going to become the telltale for the neighborhood, is incredibly important, because if
Let me interrupt you, sister.
That would be serious. Yes, Brother Waleed, go ahead.
It is strongly recommended that you never go to a parent or a spouse or a sibling, even unless they're in a program, to have them be your fifth step person you share your fifth step with. That is extremely emotionally dangerous.
Okay.
Especially,
in some programs, it's a clergy person that does the listening, but that person is instructed that, first of all, they never say anything outside of the group, and that they mainly do listening. And it's more in terms of a person of faith listening and not condemning. That is so powerful in that. The other thing of it is that I appreciated Waleed saying is that resentments. People say, well, forgive the person. Well, forgive the person. Well, a resentment is a really interesting thing, because you resent and you have all kinds of anger, but the other person doesn't even know that you have all of that. It doesn't affect the other person at all. It's just an internal destructive process that goes on with resentments. And what the AA or also the Millat-e does is later on, it asks you to go and face some of these people with both your own confession of what's happened, but also perhaps you get a sense from them about what they've done. And the final thing I would say is that there's a whole lot of stuff about power here. One of the things that's so important is many of the people that I've worked with, they did not have any power at all in what happened to them. They either had to do something to survive, or other people had a lot more power and imposed that power on them, and they were the ones that suffered out of it and took it all in. So it's, maybe I just say that because addiction is very, very complex, and we need to work at finding the beauty. I mean, I liked what the two of you said, and I like what's in here. We need to find the beauty of the person, the beauty of their soul, rather than all of the pain and the evil. And I mean, it wasn't evil, but I'm just saying, we're looking for the beauty of the person again.
Yes.
So
if I may recap, the short version from AA is that resentments are like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. It doesn't work.
So, some of the sayings in AA are just so wonderful. Like one of the ones I love is blaming never helps. Blaming doesn't get you anywhere. I use that one a lot.
Thank you so much. I mean, so I think the centrality of all of these notes that you've made, the arguments you've made, is that we value the person as an individual, as an important individual who most likely has been caught in a struggle where power is involved. And I think that is really, really important. So many people who fall for this illness or who become victims of this illness really do not have control over that illness. So that power dynamic is something that we must recognize. So therefore, we should also be conscious of not stigmatizing, not violating them in any way, and not dehumanizing them. Tasif Sab, you have a huge job.
Yeah, all the while I was actually thinking, how do I make sense of this? And I have a very sort of like maybe a subtle, short, and crisp story developed. The agar is kat karo, es pritho Greg, the es pritho Brice the Waleed, yman donwian pritho es ak sawal ki yus أسۍ اگر أسۍ پننہِ معاشرٕچ کتھ کرو چاہے سٲنۍ اِمام چھِ چاہے سٲنۍ گرٕ چھِ چاہے سٲنۍ دوس چھِ رشتہٕ دار چھِ ہمساے چھِ اُستاد چھِ رہنما چھِ کُنہِ طریٖقٕکۍ سون کیاہ چھُ رول یِمن مختلف کیپیسٹین منٛز یِمن سۭتۍ یُس تہِ اَسہِ وٕنکیٚنس یہِ منشیاتن منٛز سون بوے چھا بیٚنہِ چھا زِٹھ چھا لۄکٕٹۍ چھا یِم اَتھ منٛز مُلوث چھِ گٔمٕتۍ یا یِم اَمِکۍ مٔریض چھِ بنیمٕتۍ اکھ چیٖز یُس ہاے لایٹ گوٚو سُہ چھُ پاور ڈاینامک کہِ اکثر یُس اَسہِ گۄڈٕنیتھ تہِ تُج کتھ یُس اَسہِ سمجُن چھُ کہِ یِم چھِ حالات یُس یِمن اتھ مُصیبتس منٛز چھِ انان دہو منٛز چھِ نو یِتھۍ آسان یِم نہٕ شوقن چھِ اتھ کُن گژھان کہِ یہِ چھُ مُصیبت کُنہِ طریٖقُک نمبر ون نمبر سیکنڈ کانٛہہ چھُ کُنہِ طریٖقہٕ یِمن اتھ چیٖزس منٛز ژانان تو اَسہِ چھُ سُہ چیٖز سمجھُن نمبر ون نمبر سیکنڈ یُس اتھ منٛز ساروی کھۄتہٕ اہم چیٖز یُس درٛاو یُس اَسہِ اسلام یا دیٖن کہِ طریٖقہٕ تہِ کوٚر ہاے لایٹ چھُ حُسنہِ سلوٗک حُسنہِ سلوٗکٕچ کۭژاہ زیادٕ اہمیت چھِ کہِ یُس اتھ بٮ۪مارِ منٛز مُبتلا گوٚو کُنہِ طریٖقہٕ کہِ تٔمِس چھُنہٕ اَسہِ دکہٕ دیُن کینٛہہ تٔمِس سۭتۍ چھُنہٕ اَسہِ تیوٗتاہ یہِ کَرُن کینٛہہ کہِ سُہ گژھِ وارَے پَتھ حُسنہِ سلوٗکٕچ چھِ واریاہ زیادٕ اہمیت یُس اَسہِ اِسلام تہِ چھُ وَنان یُس أکِس یُس یِہٕنٛدۍ حالات سَمجِتھ تہِ اَسہِ نظرن منٛز چھِ تھاوُن تَمہِ پَتہٕ اوس واریاہ زیادٕ اہم اَسہِ یُس سوال کہِ اِمامن ہُنٛد رول کیاہ چھُ یا سانہِ دیٖنُک رول کیاہ چھُ تَتھ منٛز درٛاو یِہُے کہِ أسۍ کَمہِ طریٖقہٕ اَتھ ہٮ۪کو اَتھ چیٖزس اٮ۪ڈریس کٔرِتھ کہِ چاہے جمہٕکۍ خۄطبہٕ چھِ یا سٲنۍ اِمام یا مذہبی رہنما ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ کَتھ چھِ کران یا پننِس معاشرس یا لُکن سۭتۍ مُخٲطِب چھِ آسان یہِ چھُنہٕ ترٛاوُن اَسہِ کہِ یہِ تھاوو أسۍ سایڈس پٮ۪ٹھ أسۍ کَرو نہٕ اَمِچ کَتھٕے یہِ چھِ غلط چیٖز نہ کیونکہِ أسۍ چھِ اَتھ منٛز مُلوث گوٚمُت سٲنِس معاشرس منٛز چھِ وٕنکیٚنس یہِ وباہ کینسرٕکۍ پٲٹھۍ پھٲلیومُت أسۍ چھِ لگ بگ ہر اکھ گرٕ چھُ کُنہِ نتہٕ کُنہِ طریٖقہٕ اَتھ منٛز مُلوث گوٚمُت اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ چھِ کَتھ کَرٕنۍ مگر کَتھ تہِ چھِ تَتھ طریٖقس پٮ۪ٹھ کَرٕنۍ کہِ اَتھ چھُنہٕ یہِ چھُنہٕ تِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ وٕچھُن کینٛہہ کہِ یِم اَتھ منٛز یِم لُکھ چھِ تِمن سۭتۍ گژھِ حِسابن کَتہِ معاملات اَتھ منٛز چھِ یہِ وٕچھُن کہِ پانہٕ ؤنۍ کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کو أسۍ اَتھٕ جوٗڑِتھ تہٕ تِمن پلزِتھ تِمن لُکن ہٕنٛز مدد کٔرِتھ یِتھٕے کٔنٮ۪تھ چھُ یُتھُے رول سٲنِس معاشرس منٛز أکۍ گرٕ والٮ۪ن ہُنٛد تہِ ہمساین ہُنٛد تہِ دوستن ہُنٛد تہِ احبابن ہُنٛد تہِ تو میانہِ خیال I guess that was the crux of the role of people apart from the very huge discussion that we had تہٕ بیٚیہِ یُس ولید کَتھ ٲسۍ کران یُس أسۍ 12 سٹیپ پروگرامٕچ کَتھ چھِ کران یِم تہِ اگر سون کانٛہہ بوے یا بیٚنہِ یِم اَتھ منٛز چھِ مُبتلا وٕنکیٚنس گٔمٕتۍ اللہ تعالیٰ کٔڑنو تُہۍ اَمہِ منٛز یِم ٲسۍ وَنان کہِ یُس یہِ 12 سٹیپ پروگرام چھُ تَتھ منٛز کِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ چھِ بیٚیہِ ییٚلہِ أسۍ رولٕچ کَتھ چھِ کران ساروی کھۄتہٕ اہم سٹیپ 4 منٛز دوٚپ یِمو کہِ اَتھ منٛز چھِ یہِ اکھ قدم کہِ گۄڈٕنیتھ تُہۍ کوٚروٗ تسلیٖم کہِ تۄہہِ چھو پرابلم تَمہِ پتہٕ پروردِگارِ عالمیٖنس پُشراوُن پنُن پان کہِ یِم مےٚ احکام چھِ تَمہِ طریٖقہٕ زندگی پکناوٕنۍ نہ کہِ یُس مےٚ پنُن نفس یا ییٚمہِ حساب مےٚ شیطٲنیت چھِ کُنہِ حسابہٕ ژامٕژ ذہنس منٛز تَمہِ حساب پنٕنۍ زندگی پکناوٕنۍ دوٚیِم چیٖز یہِ سمجھُن کہِ مےٚ چھِ غلطی گٔمٕژ گۄناہ چھُ گوٚمُت مگر پنُن پان چھُنہٕ یہِ شیطان یِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ تہِ چھُنہٕ مایوٗس گژھُن کینٛہہ کہِ غلط چھِ گۄناہ چھِ البتہ اللہ تعالیٰ سٕنٛدِس رحمتس پٮ۪ٹھ چھِ یقیٖن تھاوُن پروردِگار سٕنٛدِس کرمس پٮ۪ٹھ چھِ یقیٖن تھاوُن سُہ پازٹِوِٹی چھِ ذہنس منٛز تھاوٕنۍ یوٗتاہ مایوٗس چھُنہٕ گژھُن کہِ سورُے ہوٗر سورُے گوٚو ختم بہٕ چھُس شیطان تہٕ وۄنۍ اندِ نہٕ کِہیٖنۍ سُہ چھُنہٕ گژھُن تمہِ پتہٕ چھِ بیاکھ اہم چیٖز کہِ اتھ منٛز پنٕنۍ حال یا یِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ اَسہِ گۄڈٕنیتھ تہِ تُل کینٛہہ نتہٕ کینٛہہ پریشٲنی چھِ آسان یُس لۄکچارس چھا گوٚمُت زندگی منٛز چھا گوٚمُت أنٛدۍ پٔکۍ چھا یُس اتھ مرحلس تام انسانس چھُ واتناوان پننِس ذہنس منٛز پننِس پانس سۭتۍ یہِ وقت دیُن چاہے کُنہِ ورکس پٮ۪ٹھ لیکھُن ڈایری پٮ۪ٹھ لیکھُن یا پننِس پانس سۭتۍ یہِ چیٖز اتھ پٮ۪ٹھ سونٛچُن کہِ کٕم چیٖز چھِ زندگی منٛز یِمن سۭتۍ مےٚ پرابلم چھِ یِمن سۭتۍ مےٚ پریشٲنی چھِ یِم مےٚ تنٛگ چھِ کران ولید سُنٛد وَنُن اوس کہِ ییٚلہِ أسۍ اَتھ چیٖزس پٮ۪ٹھ چھِ سونٛچنہِ لگان یا اَتھ پٮ۪ٹھ لیکھنہِ لگان اَسہِ چھُنہٕ اندازے آسان کہِ کۭژاہ پرابلم چھِ آسان یِم سٲنِس ذہنس پتھ چھِ آسان یِم اَسہِ باسان چھِ تِم چھنہٕ روزمژ وۄنۍ کِہیٖنۍ تِم چھِ اَسہِ پتھ ژھٕنمٕژ مگر یِمو سۭتۍ أسۍ چھِ آسان وٕنہِ تہِ پریشٲنین منٛز اضطرابس منٛز تہٕ تمہِ پتہٕ یِمن چیٖزن پٮ۪ٹھ کٲنٛسہِ یِتھِس اِنسانس سۭتۍ कत कर या तमिस पन हाल बावन युस तथ भरोसस लायक यथ पे दीनी तरीकस मज या मिलत इस्लामी यथ वनान वली वली सह कि यमिस पन पान हेको पुशरवित यमिस पे यकीन हेको कर तथ यकीनस या तथ एतबारस कदर हेक कर यह चीज बोज मगर चीज कि यह हेक पन मोल मोज बोय बेन कह अहबाब या अकारब क्योंकि कत्या सान जिसमन मज सान जिंदगी मज हत बदी तो सास बदी सिर आसान तो यह तमिस इथिस वलियस वन कि तम हिसाब जुड़ित कह अलबत्ता पेशेंटली सब्र सान यह कत हेक बूजित जज कर जज कहें अलबत्ता सिर्फ बोज तो कर मदद रिफ्लेक्ट करनस मज कि कतन प्रॉब्लम कित हेको अम प्रॉब्लम नश दूर गसित तो तम पतिक स्टेप तो इंशाल्लाह हेकू तुम वचित 12 स्टेप प्रोग्रामस मज मे मा गो कह इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट मशदी बाजी
शुक्रिया तौसीफ साहब बस सिर्फ ये वन के मिलत इस्लामी प्रोग्राम तुंद खतर अवेलेबल चाहे तुम मज या बे कुन जाए दुनिया मज ऑनलाइन मीटिंग्स तमिक लिंक अत मज पैम्फलेट शेयर कोर तह सतन यह लिंक तुम हेकू यह मीटिंग मज बिहित जॉइन कर अमुक फायदे कि यमिस जरूरत आसे तुम हेकन बन तम प्रोग्राम हिस्से तो तथ मज बाकियन लुकन कत कर बाकियन लुकन शेयर कर कॉन्फिडेंशली जन कि तुंद सीर फाश कर सो यह सठा जरूरी तो अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह यह अवेलेबल वनकस अंग्रेज पे जूम मीटिंग्स मेहरबानी कर अगर तुम जान कह तुम पता अम फायदे वात तिमन सो शेयर इंशाल्लाह इस पे मे वो यह इन्फॉर्मेशन करो उर्दू पे तर्जम तो सह करो तुम सतन शेयर
बिल्कुल मे कर बे सॉरी टू कट यू मे कर मिलत इस्लामी जूम मीटिंग गम लिंक्स त्राय मे कमेंटन मज तुम हेकू आराम सान यह वुत पे इनफरादी लेवल पे तुम कस वन या तुम अप्रोच कर कहें पन्ने जाए पे आराम सान तुम हेकू जूम मीटिंग्स जॉइन कर बेत बाजी वनान इंशाल्लाह स्टेप्स तुलमित करान अत पे उर्दू पे वार इंशाल्लाह वातन अनकरीब वातन तुह निश करो दस्तियाब चाहे यह सैनिस फेसबुक पेज या यूट्यूब या कुन जाए पे यह लिटरेचर सह करो दस्तियाब या अगर तुम थ्रू ई मेल्स सूजू तुम इनबॉक्सस मज मैसेज वातनो तुह तम बे करो कोशिश इंशाल्लाह कशिर पे अमुक तर्जुम चाहे हो सकता है अगर जबानी पे वन सह हेको कर प्रोग्राम क्रिएट ये पे रिकॉर्डेड सेशन थो बैकग्राउंडस मज ये मज कशिर पे यह जबानी चीज सो दैट तुम हेकू बूझत योतन तह यस बाजी
Thank you so much. So we're at an hour and 20 minutes almost. So in the last 10 minutes, I would like to address both of you and ask whether there are other things that we have not covered. I'm sure there is much more to cover, but are there some other important points that both of you would like to make so that we can leave this session with some concrete suggestions that people could try to adopt and at least think about and begin to have this conversation in a safe and respectable manner? Brice, first you.
One of the things that came across in the thing was, do you have to be religious to be a part of the Millat-e-Islami? The answer is no. It's, I think what you're going to find if you're a part of that or AA is that you'll find a different kind of spirituality and you'll get deeper into a whole understanding of spirituality. A lot of the men and women that I've worked with were really offended and stigmatized by evangelical Christianity in North America. And so it was very, very important that they go to AA, open their mind, see another understanding of Islam or Christianity, or even, I don't even want to put a denomination or a title on that there's a spirituality that begins to connect you with a power greater than ourselves and connect you with other people. And you will learn how to love rather than to be resentful and angry and frustrated. And we've talked a little bit about it, but no, you do not need to be religious. But the spirituality is very, very significant.
And I guess people have different understandings of spirituality. So I think that's
Oh,
important to know. So there isn't any one way of looking at spirituality, but
no.
I would say this: the idea is for a person to take the time to do an inner reflection and also then connect with whether that spirituality means taking walks in nature and sitting by the lake, or connecting with God's signs, without even calling that. That in any way as a religious symbol, that's fine too, but I think it is
Yeah.
building that connection that has been lost and repairing the broken soul in the way that the person best understands it at that
But,
level. So I
but
think
I
that's
think we just have to say nobody's going to convert you.
yes.
They're going to help you walk forward. And I've walked with people who are Hindu. I've walked with people who are Buddhist. I've walked with people who are Muslim. The struggle, I think, for people who are Muslim is that the stigma is so strong and so powerful that you really have to, if you're Muslim and somebody's walking alongside of you, or if I'm walking alongside of somebody, I just really have to be careful and kind and trustworthy and go slow, because there are, and I know I talked to one of the imams here and I said something. He said, well, any of us can stand in the line at the Jummah and stand in the line at the prayer. I said, yeah, but we have to really say, you are a part of that line. You're not, you're part of that line. You may not feel like you're adequate for that line, but you're part of that line that's going through the prayers, and you're acceptable to Allah. Um, that's so significant to say to people, because they really feel put down.
Absolutely, and I think that is such an essential part as Muslims, first of all, to embrace everybody and meet everybody wherever they are and they might be. And I think that's an important reminder for us as Muslims. Just as on Jummah the Imam says, or at every prayer the Imam says, straighten your lines and come close to one another so you don't leave room for shaitan. That is also a great reminder that we get rid of the shaitan in our minds if we're standing next to somebody that we think of as less than ourselves. So I think that is an incredibly important reminder. Brother Waleed?
I just want to recap. When any of us takes a psychoactive substance, the very first thing that happens is I lose my connection to you. Okay? I fall back into here. And as has been said many times in all the programs, my mind is a dangerous place to be. I am the most dangerous person for me. When I have connections to all of you, I have put out the antennas to also have a connection to Allah. He doesn't send out any more revelations. The last revelation was the Quran, but he continuously sends small revelations to all the people that we work with. Whether we approve of them or disapprove of what they're doing, the messages are coming through. And that is real spirituality, to be listening for that signal. It comes in many forms. The person who asked, do you have to be religious to go to a 12-step program? No, but you're going to discover once you clean that windshield off, there's some light coming in and you don't know where it's coming from. That is what we seek, and never stop seeking it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think there's a paradox, because well, your mind is your most beautiful thing, and your mind can also be very, very destructive.
Yes.
And so we need to embrace that beauty, and move forward with it, and we can do that for other people, to embrace their beauty and help them. And the other thing of it is that I know I've asked men over and over again, and I said, do you know the difference between a craving and a sense of higher power, God giving you some kind of a feeling or a word or something? And they say, Brice, there's all the difference in the world between accepting something which is good and beautiful and wonderful and a craving. They're completely different. So we need to help people to, okay, let's go for the beautiful and the good rather than the craving. And how do we do that?
On that beautiful note, I don't think I have any more to add to your wisdom that you've shared. And thank you so much for everything that has been shared here. And I hope that our audience has benefited from it. Tasif Sir, your last word, and as well as translating our last conversation.
Varia shukriya baji. Bilkul es wait andastam to endes peten yum kat dry bilkul yum do soy recap. Number one, husn saluk, painis panas andar, palzun ak bekis, tem patan role cash son as mashra, timan cheesan peten roshni trawan, yim te es kadam yatmazan, ya yus bah kadam ya 12 steps es yum discuss kair mainly it's over past step godnik yum Waleed te highlight kair, timan peten timni hundos recap we can yus es one. اگر أسۍ کٔشیٖرِ ہٕنٛز کتھ کرو اَسہِ چھِ پاے أسۍ چھِ واریاہ مُصیبت واریاہن پریشٲنین منٛز آمٕتۍ أسۍ چھِ واریاہن مُصیبتن منٛز ولنہٕ آمٕتۍ وٕنکیٚنس تہٕ یِتھِس منٛز چھِ واریاہ مُمکِن کہِ یِم سٲنۍ ینگ یا یِم یِم سٲنۍ لُکھ چھِ کٔشیٖرِ منٛز تِم ہٮ۪کن مُلوث گٔژھِتھ یا یہِ چھِ اکھ حقیٖقت تِم چھِ مُلوث گٔمٕتۍ اتھ چیٖزس منٛز وۄنۍ اتھ چیٖزس پٮ۪ٹھ چھُ میانہِ خیال ساروی کھۄتہٕ بٔڑ اہم قدم اسہِ ساروِین پٮ۪ٹھ اکھ ذمہٕ دٲری عٲید گژھان کہِ أسۍ کرو پنُن پنُن رول پلے بہٕ ایز فرد کیاہ رول ہٮ۪کہٕ پلے کٔرِتھ کہِ نمبر ون پروردِگارس پُشراوُن پنُن پان بہٕ ہٮ۪کہٕ نہٕ اتھ چیٖزس منٛز بہٕ کرٕ کوٗشش کہِ بہٕ گژھٕ نہٕ اتھ چیٖزس کُن کینٛہہ دوٚیِم چیٖز چھِ کہِ ایز معاشرٕ یِم بٲے یا یِم بیٚنہِ اتھ چیٖزس منٛز مُلوث چھِ گٔمٕتۍ کہِ أسۍ کرو نہٕ دوٗر پنُن پان تِمن نِش کینٛہہ تِمن وٕچھو نہٕ أسۍ حکارتٕچ نظرِ کینٛہہ البتہ تِمن سۭتۍ کرو أسۍ حُسنہِ سلوٗک یا اکھ أکِس پلزو تہٕ تِم کروکھ مین سٹریٖم کرنٕچ کوٗشش تتھ منٛز چھِ پتہٕ سٲنۍ اِمام سٲنۍ ریلِجس سکالر سٲنۍ سوسایٹی ہٕنٛدۍ لیٖڈر یا سٲنۍ گرٕ وٲلۍ سٲنۍ ہمساے سٲنۍ رِشتہٕ دار تِمن ساروِین ہُنٛد اکھ رول بنان تہٕ قدم بنان یِتھے کٔنیتھ انشاء اللہ یِنہٕ والٮ۪ن سیشنن ہٕنٛز انفارمیشن چھِ تۄہہِ نِش تِمن پٮ۪ٹھ تہِ کرو أسۍ وارٕ کارٕ تۄہہِ بیٚیہِ فٔردر انفارمیشن دِنٕچ ضروٗر کوٗشش دوٚیِم واریاہ اکھ اہم چیٖز کہِ برایس یا ولید یِمن دۄنوٕیَن ہٕنٛز انفارمیشن چھِ اَسہِ تھٲومٕژ آلریڈی ایویلیبل سٲنِس فیس بُک پیجس پٮ۪ٹھ اگر تُہۍ یِمن انڈِوِجؤلی یا انڈِپینڈنٹلی تہِ ہیٚکِو ریٖچ آوُٹ یژھِو ریٖچ آوُٹ کرُن تُہۍ ہیٚکِو کٔرِتھ یِمن یا یُس یِہٕنٛدۍ پروگرامٕز چھِ الکوہولِکس انانمس ییٚمِچ یِمو کتھ کٔر یا مِلت اِسلامی تِمن یژھِو ریٖچ آوُٹ کرُن پلیٖز تُہۍ ہیٚکِو آرام سان تِمن ریٖچ آوُٹ کٔرِتھ سانہِ طرفہٕ تہِ روزِ آیندس تہِ یِہٕے کوٗشش نمبر ون یُس یِم 12 سٹیپ پروگرام چھِ مِلت اِسلامیُک أسۍ کرو جلد از جلد انشاء اللہ تۄہہِ تامتھ یہِ واتناونٕچ کوٗشش نمبر ون نمبر ٹوٗ کہِ یِم یِنہٕ وٲلۍ انشاء اللہ سیشن چھِ تِمن منٛز تہِ آسہِ بالکل یِتھے کٔنۍ سون فوکس کہِ یُس أسۍ یہِ ڈرگ ایڈِکشنٕچ کٔشیٖر منٛز وباہ چھِ یا پرابلم چھِ اتھ کِتھ کٔنۍ کرو أسۍ مُقابلہٕ اتھ خِلاف کِتھ کٔنۍ ہٮ۪کو أسۍ کھڑا گٔژھِتھ تتھ منٛز ساروی کھۄتہٕ ضروٗری یا ساروی کھۄتہٕ اہم چھِ یہِ سمجُن کہِ اَسہِ چھِ یِم لُکھ پانس سۭتۍ تھاوٕنۍ نہ کہِ یِم لُکھ یِم چھِ یِمن دِمو أسۍ دکہٕ یا بیٚیہِ ژھٕنوکھ پتھ کُن تہٕ باجی is there anything you'd like to add to it?
No, thank you to you. Thank you to Brice and Waleed. So it's been great. Unless anyone has any last points to share.
But I guess
May Allah help us all.
Yes, inshallah.
Ameen ya Allah, Ameen ya Allah. Brother Waleed, Brice, it was really fantastic. Number one, seeing you, and thank you so very much for your time and very important and wonderful suggestions, information, experiences, and knowledge that you shared with us. I'm sure that our people have actually enriched and liked your discussions. Inshallah, we'll have a feedback, and I guess many more people in the coming days would be engaging with the session. And if there's anything that comes for you people, we'll try and get to you, inshallah.
Please.
And thank you so very much for your time. Mohtaram Nazreen, واریاہ شُکریہ تُہُنٛد یِم تہِ اَسہِ سۭتۍ آز جُڑِتھ روٗدۍ اَسہِ سۭتۍ جُڑِتھ روزنُک اَسہِ سۭتۍ پارٹِسِپیٹ کرنُک اِنشاءاللہ نَیہِ ہفتہٕ بیٚکِس سیشنَس خٲطرٕ تہِ چھِ أسۍ تیٲری کران وارٕ کارٕ یِنہٕ وٲلۍ کینٛہہ سیشنز یِتھ کٔنٮ۪تھ تُہۍ ہیٚکِو آلریڈی سٲنِس فیس بُک پیجس پٮ۪ٹھ وٕچھِتھ تِم چھِ بالکل أتھی ڈرگ ایڈِکشنس رِلیٹِڈ الگ الگ پہلوٗ یُس اَمِکۍ چھِ تِم چھِ أسۍ اِنشاءاللہ ہاے لایٹ یا تِم سمجھنٕچ کوٗشِش کران چاہے سُہ کیوٗریٹِو چھےٚ یا ایجوکیٹِو چھِ یُس اَسہِ اِنٹرڈکشنس منٛز ووٚن تہٕ اِنشاءاللہ نَیہِ ہفتہٕ کرو بیٚیہِ تۄہہِ سۭتۍ مُلاقات کرنٕچ کوٗشِش توٚتام روٗزِو تُہۍ تہِ خۄدایَس حوالہٕ أسۍ تہِ خۄدایَس حوالہٕ